let's move on. And this is the last topic. Topic is an array. So very often we want to do something to a lot of variables. We want to do exactly the same thing to a lot of variables. For example, maybe we got a bunch of counts and amounts in our data set, and we want to log all of them. Or maybe we've done a bunch of 5-point satisfaction scales, and we want to reverse code them. So we want to take all the we had them oriented the wrong way, where 1 was very satisfied, and 5 was very dissatisfied. And well, we kind of like satisfied to be bigger than very dissatisfied, so we'd want to change the order of that. So all the 1s would go to 5s, all the 2s would go to 4s, and so forth. So that's reverse coding. Well, if I had 100 satisfaction questions, I don't want to have 100 recode statements to change the orientation. Therefore, I'm going to use an array. So arrays allow me to do something many times to a set of variables. There's other uses of arrays, but let's just stick with that first application today. Let me give you a little example. So in this example, let's say I read in 4 variables. I'll call them A, B, C, and D. And suppose I'd like to transform these variables, and I don't want to overwrite them, so we'll create a new variable. I want to transform them by taking the logs. So this next statement is going to declare 4 variables, log A through log D, and I'll give them lengths of 4, meaning they'll take 4 bytes. More on the length statement next time. Now, I'm going to define an array. So let's look at this statement really carefully. We're going to define an array, and I'm going to call my array X. I could call it whatever I want, but X is kind of what you call arrays if you can't think of anything better to call them. The star in the middle indicates, let SAS count the number of variables that I list after this. Now, I could have said something like 1:4, which would say I want an array, and it's going to be 1 through 4. All right, it would be the index of this array. But in this case, let's just let SAS count it. Now, after that, I'm going to follow it with a list of variables. So I'm listing A, B, C, and D. Now, the way to think about what's going on is X1 is going to point at the first variable in this list. X2 is going to be the second variable. X3 will be pointing to C, and X4 will be pointing to D. So you can think of X1 as an alias for A. There's not really a variable X1 out in my data set, but but I can call it X1 for convenience. Now I'm going to make a corresponding array for my log variables. So log X will be the name of another array, and that's going to point to these 4 new variables that I'm going to create. Now let's have a do loop. So we're going to say do I equals 1 to the dimension of X. So the dimension of X says how many variables are in this array X, and so SAS counts there's 4. So this is going to be a do loop from 1 to 4. We're going to compute a new variable, well, log X I. So in the first case, it's going to be log X1. Log X1 points to the variable log A. This is going to take the value, the logarithm function of X sub 1. So what is X sub 1? Well, X sub 1 points at A. Then, I'm going to go through this loop again. I is now 2, so the second element in this array, so log B, is going to be the logarithm of B. Log C is going to be the logarithm of C, and so forth. So if we go downstairs and look at this, here's what you get. The logarithm of 1 is 0. Looks like it's working. And so you see that I've just computed the logarithm of all 4 variables. Now you're saying I could just type 4 log statements and be done with it, and you're right. But if you had 100 variables and you wanted to transform them all in the same way, then this array statement would save you a ton of work. And it's also much more easily maintained. For example, if I decided I don't want the log of this, I want the log of the variable +1 because sometimes the variables equal 0, well, I would just go up here and say +1, and that's changed for all of the transformations. So you make very easily maintained code by using these arrays. Let me give you a few more examples of this. How do we reverse code? So again, let's say I have some satisfaction scales, and the way the survey was organized was 1 was very satisfied, 2 was satisfied, all the way through 5 is very dissatisfied. It's not very intuitive to have larger numbers indicating less satisfaction, so it'd be nice to reverse code these. How do I reverse code? Well, if you just take 6 minus a value, it's reverse coded. So 6 minus 1 is 5, therefore 1 gets mapped to 5. 6 minus 2 is 4, so 2 gets mapped to 4. What happens to 5? Well, 6 minus 5 is 1, so 5 gets mapped to 1. So how would I reverse code these? In this case, I'm just going to overwrite the original variables. You might not always want to do that. In that case, you have to to make some new variables with the length statement as I had before. So let's have an array x, which points to x1 through x4. So here I'm using the dash notation. So you can see if I had 100 variables, all I have to do is say x1 through x100 and I'm done. Do I equals 1 to the dimension of x. X is going to take the value 6 minus x. Right, so let's see what happens. The value 1 gets transformed to 5. The value 3 gets transformed to 3. The value 2 gets transformed to 2. Here's another example. Sometimes on a survey, you measure how satisfied are you with some aspect, and then you ask, well, how important is that aspect? And you often want to form what's called a weighted satisfaction score as the product of those two. So, if you're very satisfied with something that's not very important to you, that should be, kind of a lower priority than if you're very satisfied with something that's very important to you. And so the product captures that. So in this case, I'm going to read in 3 satisfaction scores. Pretend I had 3 questions measuring satisfaction, then here's their importance. And I want to compute the product of them. All right, so I'm going to have one array pointing at the satisfaction. I'm going to have another array pointing at their importance. I just noticed that that should really be a 3. I will change that before I give you the handout. The code obviously ran, but I will change that for you. It's not a big deal here, but anyway, I'm gonna make some new variables, prod1 through prod4, and we'll give them a length of 4 bytes, and then let's have an array that points to those 4. So now I want to compute the products of these. So, okay, prod1 would be satisfaction 1 times importance 1, and so forth. So let's go see what happens. 1 times 2 is 2. 3 times 3 is 9. 2 times 4 is 8. What happens with the second question? Well, 4 times 2 is 8, and so forth. So that's yet another example. One more example. Sometimes you have a bunch of values and you want to find which variable number is largest. Now, if I want to know what is the largest value, it's simple. I'll use the max function, which was the first thing I talked about today. But if I want to know, well, which of the columns has that largest value, here's how I would do it. So let's read in some values, and I'm going to have an array. So this array will point to values 1 through 4. And we're going to start out by assuming that the largest value is in column 1. So max col is going to indicate the column number of the largest value. Now we're going to have a loop. We're going to start with column 2 in this case, or variable 2, and go to the last of these x's. And we're just going to say, well, if this column, so in this case x2, is bigger than x sub max col, so max col was 1, then we're going to set max col equal to I because we found a new largest value. And we're going to keep doing that until we get to the end of the list of variables. So let's go see what happens. If we look at this first row, which column has the largest value? Well, the fourth does. So max column indicates that the fourth variable is largest. Let's look at the next row. 4, 3, 2, 1. Which column has the largest value? Well, column 1 does. So therefore max col is equal to 1. And hopefully you see how this works. Now, in the instance when you have ties, let's look at what happens in this row. Notice both 1 and 4 have the largest values. Max col's 1 since I'm doing a strictly greater than. If I'd said greater than or equal to, then the max col would be 4. So it's not clear what's the right answer there. Is 1 or 4 the right answer? They're both right. And if that's not what you want, you'd have to figure out another way of identifying whatever you do want. All right, so that's another example of how we use loops and arrays to do something that would be pretty tedious otherwise. So that's the end of this lecture, and you're going to get some exercises to help you practice all of these things.